back with our regularly scheduled Stephen King tier list programming. Are you excited for this one? Because I definitely am. Up to this point, we have already ranked Stephen King's first 10 books, his best movie adaptations, his books from the 1980s, and now today we turn our focus to his collection from the 1990s. A very interesting group of books, to say the least, especially coming off one of his most prolific decades in the 80s and possibly one of his best decades of writing. So what will I think about his 90s collection? Let's take a look and find out. A lot of these books from the 90s from Stephen King were the first books I ever read of his, because these were the ones that I was finding in my local Goodwill when I was like in high school. I'd go to Goodwill, go straight to the book section after my shift at my part-time job and spend whatever money I'd made from those couple hours of work on books. And that's where I got a lot of my first edition Stephen King books for like $1 or $2 a pop. Beyond that, in terms of cover design, it goes from like the Stephen King font that you envision when you see Stranger Things and all these other pieces of media that have tried to like imitate this sort of retro horror style, and gets into some terrible 90s graphic design. But there are some gems in this collection. We'll start with the first book here. Rose Matter was one of the first Stephen King books that I bought and read after reading Salem's Lot, which was the first ever Stephen King book I read. Rose Matter is a really interesting one. It's very on the nose in terms of criticizing and focusing on domestic violence, and I think in interviews Stephen King has even talked about how like he thought this novel was trying too hard and it's not one of his favorites in terms of his own backlog. But I kind of liked this in his collection. It's very unique. It deals with Greek mythology to some extent. Essentially our main character is fleeing her husband who has abused her. He works in law enforcement and he's known for tracking people down, so the fact that she flees him in the first place is a pretty risky move. But beyond that, she's without much money and she ends up in a pawn shop where she is drawn to this painting which depicts a bull and some other Greek mythology related elements. She discovers that in a sort of dream state she can enter and escape into this painting where there's this whole other fantastical world. And I know people who don't like this one at all. I know people who have said this is their absolute favorite Stephen King novel. I'm going to say this one, it might be B tier for me. I fondly remember reading this one. I like the main character. I like the way the plot develops in the sort of final showdown. By the way, I won't be spoiling any of these. Rose Matter, one I definitely enjoyed. The next book, Bag of Bones. At the time I read this, I thought it was okay. In recollection, I don't think it's that great, and I don't know if it was a worthwhile read, so I'm gonna put it in D tier. Did I waste my time reading this? It's this guy whose wife tragically passes away. He's a writer, another example of Stephen King making the main character a writer, flees to this like lake house, this cabin that he soon discovers is haunted, and it just feels pretty routine for the most part. There's nothing particularly special happening here. One ghost in this cabin tries to help this writer who discovers this sort of historical case in the geographical area that was never really solved. The ghost like helps the writer solve the case. Too long for what it was. It probably could have been a novella, even a short story. I didn't think this needed to be a full-length novel. And it was one that I read pretty fast, but not for the best reasons. More so because I did not have the ability to DNF books at the point in time in which I read Bag of Bones, and I didn't put it down. I just read it as fast as possible. Let's move on to the next one. The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. This is a book that you could read in a day. This is one of Stephen King's shorter books. It's this girl who loved Tom Gordon. No, I'm just kidding. But she did love Tom Gordon, who was a baseball player on the Red Sox. This is definitely a nod to Stephen King's loyalty to all things Boston, New England. It's this girl who pretty much gets through a pretty terrifying, surreal experience of getting lost in the woods following some poor experiences with her family, where she just kind of wanders off, and the whole book is just her being lost and not having a great time in the woods. There's not a lot else to it beyond that. I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. I'd say if there was a category between C and D tier for The Girl Who Loved Tom and Gordon, I'd put it there. But for sake of positivity, because we can always use more positivity in the world, throw it in C tier. Cool. A good barometer for the quality of Stephen King books. How many copies do you see on a regular basis if you frequent secondhand shops or donation shops? When I go to Goodwills to sort of like look for books, I always see Desperation, The Regulators, Bag of Bones, and The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. So maybe that's a good, measuring stick for the quality of some of these. Yeah, we're pretty middle of the road so far through the first three. The next one that I didn't read until 2022, it's The Green Mile. It was originally a serial publication where it was released like month by month in 6 parts, and then they kind of slapped it all together. And you can kind of tell in the way that it is structured, because every time you complete part 1, for instance, part 2, it will have a catch you up section of it where it will reference pretty much everything that was just going on in the beginning of the next part, which kind of reading it the whole way through in its entirety can feel really redundant, and it can feel like, why is Stephen King writing this as if his readers are stupid? I remember that thing happening like 2 pages ago. I don't need this. But when you realize sort of the origin story of this book's publication, it makes a lot more sense. The Green Mile is really solid. It has an interesting cast of characters, an interesting setting taking place in sort of like a death row prison in the South. And it has that sort of like classically misunderstood main character who is wrongfully convicted of a crime, and they're just kind of trying to help him out after they discover on death row that he was wrongly convicted, and has some like very interesting supernatural elements. I really enjoyed The Green Mile. I wouldn't say it's like classic Stephen King in the horror sense, but I would say it's still very much so a quality read. I wish there were more tiers. I'm gonna put absolutely would recommend. This would be a quality read for a very wide range of different types of people. And if somebody asked me what Stephen King book should I read if I'm not absolutely in love with the horror genre, The Green Mile would probably be the first thing I would recommend to them. The Wastelands by Stephen King. This is the 3rd book in the Dark Tower fantasy series. If you've watched my previous tier lists, you know that this is like the point at which I fell in love with this series and sort of like declared that it was my favorite book series of all time. The Wastelands is one of Stephen King's best books that he's ever written. It takes place right after the events of book 2. This is where it becomes like a very Tolkien-esque travel log where they're making their way to Midworld, and we sort of start to understand like what the actual objective and purpose of this series is, and it becomes a lot more intriguing. You start to fall in love with these characters, you start to see their quirks, their faults, so that's gonna go straight to S tier. I think we can just move to the 4th book here and put it there too, because I think this may very well be the best book that Stephen King's ever written. In terms of narrative structure, character development, this is one of my favorite books ever. Sort of like a frame story structure. So again, obviously it takes place directly after the events of the 3rd book, and they continue to travel. They arrive at a mysterious city, but you get to a certain point where it begins to engage with this structure where it is a story within a story. They sort of stop. Our main character, Roland, begins to reveal a lot more of like his backstory and his background, which is, I feel like, very much so needed, because he's a mysterious sort of polarizing figure for the first 2 or 3 books, and you start to understand sort of the baggage that he brings as a main character. He is developing this huge world within the massive world that he has already created. Wizard and Glass, again, it may very well be his best written book that he's ever put out, and it's probably one of, if not my favorite Stephen King book that I've ever read. If you haven't had enough glowing endorsements to read the Dark Tower series on my channel, this is another one. Read the Dark Tower series. Books 3 and 4 make it worth it to begin with. All right, we are beyond the Dark Tower at this point as we move into Needful Things. This is a book that I read in 2022. I liked it. I didn't love it. I'm gonna throw it with rose madder and basically good. It is sort of the tried and true method of Stephen King working within a very familiar setting. For him, that's like Derry, Maine, or in this case, Castle Rock, bringing back familiar faces from past books. This is a real showcase of Alan Pangborn for the first time. And there's some interesting tie-ins to some other like Stephen King universe elements, especially like towards the end. I won't spoil what happens. It's a massive book, might be needlessly long, Needful Things, but it's still really, really good. And there are interesting characters brought back. It's a fun setting to get reacquainted with like Ace Merrill and Alan Pangborn. A number of other characters. Leland Gaunt, who is the main antagonist, the villain in this, is one of Stephen King's best villains that he's ever written, in my opinion. I wish he honestly would have showcased Leland Gaunt a little bit more, especially towards the ending. It's much more so like Leland Gaunt's influence and effect on the residents of Castle Rock rather than Leland Gaunt doing a lot of the action himself. It is a nice commentary on like capitalism and the way people get obsessed with the stuff they have and comparing themselves to others. If you like a chaotic, long book, Needful Things is for you. The next one, Gerald's Game. Absolutely brutal, but liked it a lot. I'm gonna throw it on A tier. About a year and a half since I read it, but I still like remember every single thing about that book. And for someone who can be as like scatterbrained as me, you know, once I start reading a new book, at times completely forget the plot of the book before. Gerald's Game has had a lot of lasting power in my mind, which I think certainly says something. It's sort of like a twin book with Dolores Claiborne, which is the next book on this list. It's all sort of based on this eclipse. Essentially, that eclipse is featured in flashbacks as a wife and a husband are having some fun. He brings some like law enforcement grade handcuffs into the fold. He goes unconscious as a result of a heart attack. Next thing you know, she is stuck to a bed with no access to literally anything. She is just like latched on to the bedpost with her husband on the floor, the front door open, and a whole lot of crazy stuff happens in the night. It is brutal. It is hard to put down. It is hard to stomach. And it's one of the most like personal, visceral reading experiences I've had. Let's move to Dolores Claiborne. I think it's better than The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, but I think it's worse than The Green Mile and Gerald's Game. So it's gonna go in basically good. This one is structurally really interesting. It's about this woman who is just sort of like in an interrogation room confessing, and that's the way it's narrated pretty much all throughout. And it's about this pretty wacky event that happens in her personal life with her husband during this eclipse that occurs. So the eclipse happening in real time with Dolores Claiborne is what is flashed back to in Gerald's Game, which creates a really interesting way of reading these two. I would recommend reading these two back to back if you can. We have 3 books left, and we have 2 of my most recent reads, Desperation and The Regulators. Not my favorite. I would put Desperation like between C and D. I think I said that about The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon as well. The Regulators, it warrants pairing these two up as they were co-published. I really did not enjoy The Regulators because I think it had like a very dulling effect when I read Desperation right before it, and I pretty much read them back to back, which kind of made it even worse. I have a full review on Desperation and The Regulators, which I talked about both of these books at length. You can check that out if you're interested in it. It's more interesting in the way it's done in Desperation than it is in Regulators, and Regulators just kind of feels like a poor repeat of Desperation. We will move to the last book from the 90s here. Again, didn't deal with any short story, novella collections, or Bachman books. Insomnia. This is another book that Stephen King has said that he does not like when it comes to his collection. I actually really liked this one, and I'm going to put it all the way up at A tier. Now again, not only did Stephen King talk about this in a way that points towards him not being too fond of this book, but I've heard other people who didn't like this book and said it was a total snooze fest, pun intended. Insomnia is one of the most multiverse conscious, Dark Tower reference laden books that Stephen King has written, and I'm pretty much a sap for that kind of stuff, and it's really easy to get me on board when you start referencing all different kinds of things that are relevant to the Dark Tower universe, especially some like specific characters in this book. I'm gonna make a video in the future about like my recommended Dark Tower series reading order, because this book is really important to your understanding of where one of the most important characters in the whole Dark Tower series comes from. This is one of their origin stories, and I won't say which character it is. A guy, he can't sleep well, doesn't have his wife. All of a sudden he starts to experience like these hyper reality symptoms from his insomnia and starts to see things from like other dimensions and realizes that the world as he knows it is really much so being threatened by these figures from the other dimension, and they're sort of pointing towards people from his own reality that may pose a huge threat. Insomnia also takes place in Derry, Maine, so if you've read It by Stephen King, you get to revisit that setting. All the different references and everything going on in it. It's a very long book. It requires some patience. He does a lot of like solo guitarist improvising, going on massive tangents, but he eventually makes his way back. That is my final tier list for Stephen King's books from the 90s. I'd love to hear what you think of it down in the comments. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. I would pretty much consider everything on this list from B up rereadable in my eyes. Everything from C tier down, I probably won't touch with a 10-foot pole in the future. Which of these books are your absolute favorite? Let me know down in the comments. Make sure to leave a like, to subscribe. If you want to see my other King tier list, you can check out the playlist in the end screen. We'll see you next time. Peace.